and we will start with the second half of morning sessions. And I will tell you how we have approached some quite complicated task of merging two different sets of quite complex documents. So enjoy.
Right. Good morning. It isn't anymore. I was just saying to Eric how glad I am not to have had his spot right after the social dinner. That said, before I get down to business, during lunch, there will be a Markup UK flyer out there on the desk with a discount code for Markup UK for XMLPrague attendees. So be sure to pick up one. Right, so I'm going to talk about legislation, sort of, actually about Swedish law and what I've been doing the last 6 months or so. I'm employed by a legal publisher in Denmark called Karnov Group, and in 2017, they bought another legal publisher in Sweden, in Stockholm, Sweden, Nordström. And as you all probably know, I don't know, if you merge companies, there will be all kinds of problems to be solved. Systems need to be merged, information needs to be merged, and that's really what I want to talk about here today. Because both companies produce online and paper versions of the currently enforced Swedish law, the code of the Swedish Code of Statutes, or SFS as we call it. This is about 10,000 documents maybe a little more, hard to tell actually. About half of them are in force today. And this is a quote from Wikipedia, basically. And as I said, both companies produce these. And what they do is they put them out online, and they, above all, they put it in this beautiful yearly printed book. This is a Nordström's law book, printed yearly, and it's a funny thing in Sweden because whenever they mention a legal case in the news, this is the book they show. So it's a very high-profile thing. It's their flagship product. And both companies annotate the basic Swedish laws, you know, commentary, annotations, references to case law, all kinds of stuff you do as a legal publisher. So there are a whole bunch of editors adding stuff constantly. And the way it works, well, it works like this. You have the basic law, which is a bunch of law paragraphs. The law paragraph is the basic units of a law, so to speak. Both companies, add content. They extend the basic laws with their own information. Well, you expect the law to be the same, right? So what we have here at Karnov and Nordström is the same basic text being tagged in XML in two different vocabularies. And since you merge companies where you don't want to be maintaining two separate sources of what should be the same text, eventually they will want to go to a common online platform, obviously. No need to have two systems where you can have one, right? You'd think so anyway. But, and this is really important, everything they do needs to include this, because the law book is, again, a flagship product. And this is a Nordström product, and what they do is that they add content specifically for this printed volume. Very important. And me, well, I got this on my desk about 6 months ago. And the idea was to merge the two, see how it could be done. This is my basic approach. You have the Karnov sources and the Nordström sources, and you convert those to a common, sum of all evil kind of DTD. You diff them, merge them, and in the end you produce something we call KG++, which is an authoring DTD for the new merged information. But here's what you need to understand first. Now, both companies get the actual law text from the Swedish government. There's an office, handing out these. It's a part of the democracy. But what they do is they provide text files, PDF files, nothing with tags on, nothing, you recognize the tags anyway. So what the editors do is they look at the files and they think that, well, that's a chapter heading. The law paragraphs are easier because they have this squiggly little thing in front of them, right? So that's easier to tag. But there are all kinds of headings and various text formats, lists and tables and stuff. And what the editors do when editing a new version of the law is they tag it in a way they think it should be. And this results in two very, very different semantics for what should have been the same thing. So what I did first, I pretty much ignored both sources. I just looked at the actual output of the laws, did an information analysis, sort of a limited one. What is a law? How do you actually write one? What kind of tags would I like to see there? So I did this basic exchange format expressing my idea of the law. And I took 4 sample laws of varying sizes. Criminal law was one. My colleague Henrik up there, he usually uses alkohollagen, which is the law about, alcohol and stuff. I love that. And eventually, though, I did look at the Nordström sources. I started from there. I wrote a basic conversion pipeline, a bunch of XSLTs that converted the 4 documents to this common format. That's easy enough. Did the same with the Karnov sources, again writing a pipeline. And what happened is that the results were so different, so inconsistent, that I sort of thought, no, I'm going to do something else. I'm not doing this. So I went on writing these pipelines, the Karnov format to the exchange format, the Nordström format to the exchange format. As I am talking here to you today, the Karnov to exchange pipeline is about 59 steps, give or take, and the Nordström's perhaps 1 step more, 1 less. And I tweaked the whole thing until I got sort of comparable results in the exchange format. Not identical, but comparable. You'd be surprised how different semantics you'd get. And so I expanded this. I took every single law available to me from both sources, from the 1960s, very good decade, that one. You see, in 1967, we had this little legal thing where everyone switched sides, went from being British to being Swedish, you could say. Lots of laws being written there. And I spent lots of time there, and eventually I got them to work reasonably well. But, I mean, we're talking about 10,000 laws, right? So I uploaded Nordström sources, Karnov sources to an Exist database and started doing very, very simple queries about context, you know. When do you use this thing? Where do you use that? In which context? And started expanding my pipelines. Because the fact is that most of the legislation in Sweden was written after the 1960s, actually. So if somebody says that, well, there's more and more legislation being done today, yes, they are right. We are governed by so many laws, you wouldn't believe it. And decided until I was satisfied with everything. And it all sort of validated against the exchange D2D. And I could really start looking at what happens. I'd just like to say a few words about tools before I go into detail. I mentioned the pipelines because, well, I am a pipelines kind of guy. Exbrook has been mentioned a lot, and I used an Exbrook 1 pipeline, or Exbrook 1 pipelines for all of this. Specifically, there's this former colleague of mine, Nick Gibson, who's done something very valuable called Exbrook Tools, freely available at GitHub. Highly encourage you to take a look if you're interested. And what they do is they allow you to take a pipelined approach to XSLT transform. So what you do is you write a manifest file listing a bunch of XSLTs, each and every one doing a single task, really. The thing here is to be focused and just do one thing. And if you want to do something else in the same step, you're overdoing it, right? You just do a new step. And the beauty is that you can switch places on, you know, each XSLT step just by copying and pasting. You can comment out a step and see what goes on. And you can also do lots of debugging, because what the Exbrook does, it saves the output from each and every XSLT. Now, if you do this on 10,000 Swedish law files, that's a lot of debugging. But it's tremendously useful. Did fill up my hard drive, though. So let me give you a bit of context, too. This, you don't have to actually understand all of it. I mean, lots of angle brackets, right? This is a Karnov source. You'll notice, if you look very carefully, the sticker, that's a text element. Inside that, there's character data, and there's a list. So it's this weird mixed content, block level to text, and mixed in all kinds of awful ways. Note also that the list is manual. I don't know if you can see the list element, there's a tag, and there's somebody scribbled down the list item label. And why do they do this? Well, because it looks prettier. Because the default way of an ordered list formats it a bit differently. So the editors do what they think looks better. Here's the Nordström's version of the same thing. You'll notice that the inline references are all text. There's no markup for the references. On the other hand, there's information in there not present in the Karnov version. This is also not mixed content in any way. It's neatly on block level lists and stuff. You don't mix block level and text nodes the way Karnov did. And this, of course, is what we want. We want a combined text in the exchange format. What this means, and I realized this very, very early on, is that before I ever get to the exchange format, I need to do lots and lots and lots of upconversion. Things like the manual list. I need to do them, I need to spot them, upconvert them to ordered lists if at all possible, because I need comparable semantics. I don't know what the other source is doing for that same text, but I will assume that they don't do tag abuse more than they have to. So upconvert whenever possible. The fake list, for instance, this is, somebody just thought, what the heck, I'm just using P here, and I'm upconverting this. The mixed content was a bit of a nightmare. Since only Karnov had that, I also had to upconvert that. I had to add explicit block level tags around any text to make the both sources comparable. And this one is fun. So any sane XML person would probably use chapter and section structures, the pretty container things, containers within containers, etc., to express sections, chapters, parts. Neither publisher did. Frequently, they would use running headers, which are, headers stuck pretty much in between other content, indicating, well, here's a header. They used, you can spot the type attribute there. There's a figure there, type equals 3. Now that's a larger font than type 4. It's a smaller font. So the presentation is an implied section structure, right? But it's only implicit. And this wasn't consistently used because the model, I don't know if you read DTDs, but pretty much any model would allow these headers, these running headers, to be inserted instead of a paragraph or a chapter or a part, or, So it was a mess. So what I did, there was a step that very, very early on in my conversion upconverted recursively to actual nested groups. Not that hard to do because of the type attribute thing at Nordström. Karnov was a bit harder because they had several different running header elements. Hated that. And I had to do this early because when manipulating the semantics, I needed to manipulate them as sections, contained sections, addressing them as a unit rather than a loose running header and things like that. But that's only in the upconversion to the exchange format. Once you're in the exchange format, it turns out that the number of running headers are not the same at Karnov and Nordström. So it was impossible to reliably diff those nested groups. I had to convert them back. And I inserted something I called group divided, simply to say that, okay, here's going to be a group, a nested group. So I don't have to do all the more expensive XSLT I did in the upconversion. Because when I finally diffed, we use Delta XML's XML Compare, which is a terrific tool. I don't know if you all seen it, but what it does, it inserts attributes and things to, indicate A or B only things, or where A and B differ from one another. So in this example, you can see that there's an extra header only present in the B version. So flattening these grouped headers allowed me to diff. Well, after which I can group them again. I mean, So we were talking about diffing and merging. This is basically all about upconversion, making the semantics comparable. Well, merging is a bit different, because what you do is first you diff your sources, you get this delta XML markup indicating where the differences are, and then you use another pipeline to merge, programmatically, using various rules. For that sort of thing, you can key some of the elements, so you will always know that there will always be law paragraphs in both documents. They're normative. They're supposed to be there. Chapters are sometimes normative. Versions of law paras are normative. So what we could do was add Delta XML keys, which is a device to help you tell the XML Compare software that these things should actually be the same node. Tremendously useful. One interesting problem that is in the merge domain, just want to show you this. Somebody in one source thought that adding a second paragraph to the last list item here looks prettier when printed, because there's an indentation, there's a margin, left margin. Whereas the other source puts it where it belongs, here. And this was pretty much a nightmare to actually diff, because there's so many different permutations of this. I ended up with several steps just looking at list variations, most of which I had to do in the merge. We also had global decisions, that kind of thing was very much doing XLT steps and spotting this sort of thing and doing stuff with it. But we could also sometimes say that, okay, we're always going to use the annotations from the Nordström's content because they are more extensive. And we're always going to include Karnov's so-called note xrefs, which is a product by itself, so it must always be there. We had per document preferences, basically editors analyzing things like what supplements in law books do we prefer, because those were just a nightmare to merge. It wasn't possible, basically, because supplements are not normative. You can write them any way you want. And so they had to choose. And we ended up with a config file that pretty much lists what you're doing, which supplements you prefer in which documents. We also had that sort of thing in the config file per element sometimes. So you give an ID or a context or something, and that way the merge pipeline would know how to process this. A couple of odds and ends. I'm really going to skip most of this because the authoring DTD, KG++, that's just a restrictive version of the exchange format, right? I mean, instead of OR groups, repeatable optional OR groups, which are the domain of exchange DTD formats, you can do sequences and you can be more restrictive. I mean, the pipeline to convert exchange, the merged exchange format to KG++ is about 15 steps. and most of those are really short. But we also, as I mentioned very early on, we have the printed law book, and we absolutely had to continue providing this thing. So we also went back to the old NJ legacy format for printing purposes only, not to author anything, but there's a pipeline that goes back to the old format to use the old publishing mechanism, because that's sort of a horrible task to do now in the new formats. So, conclusions, well, it's doable. Manual selection will always be necessary because, well, sometimes the sources are just too different. Tag abuse or just different interpretations of the same basic source, the legal source from the government. And as with everything else, most problems are actually cultural and political, and I won't go into those except to just mention that, well, these are two companies merging. Their cultures are wildly different, he said bitterly. And I want to thank you for listening and leave you with the Swedish politician expressing what's right in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. Also, I've been quite surprised to not hear anything about SGML and cinemas in your talk. Okay, so any questions? Over there from Matt.
I have a question with regards to the source format. You said two different things, like you said plain text and you said PDF. So what it is really the input format from the Swedish Parliament, I guess?
What the source formats were? Well, they tended to provide them on, you know, on on leather rolls like the British Parliament a couple of hundred years ago. They moved on to text files, PDFs. There are sometimes HTML documents on the new SFS site where they are publishing things. But as far as I know, they do not produce anything structured. The closest they come is probably Microsoft Word. And let's face it, I mean, politicians are not the most structured people around.
So I'm working on something not a million miles away for the US legislature. And I noted with interest that you had list items that auto-generated the number. Mm-hmm. And did you find there problems where things like in the drafting process of the law, someone like left out a number in a list, and because it's the law, you have to leave out the number in the list. You can't auto-generate the correct sequence of numbers. And did you have any problems with that kind of stuff where one format was preferring auto-generation and reality doesn't always allow that?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, lots of them. I mean, if you update a paragraph with a list, you might do with, you know, adding a list item 2A and 2B. And what my upconversion step did was basically it looked for those things, and whenever it found something that wasn't just, you know, a straight sequence, it would leave it as a manual list. Because, yeah, you're not allowed to change those. But, I mean, that's true for not only list items, that's true with paragraphs and subparagraphs. Because if you add a new version, you're not allowed necessarily to change the present numbering. You have to add a letter, and that's sort of hairy. There's also a related problem with the valid from and valid to days, which I consciously avoided discussing today. So, yeah.
Yeah, there is another question from David. Probably this will be the last one.
Yeah, one more question. Are you aware of the Acomantoso Oasis format? Have you considered this as the pivot?
Not really, because I mean, we're not even allowed to choose the proper language for the tags and the attribute names. I'd prefer Klingon, obviously, but so yeah, I would very much like to, but I don't think my employer would allow that, fortunately.
Okay, so there are no more questions. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.